Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we talk about how to use mobile user acquisition strategies to grow your app quickly and capital efficiently. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, mobile growth leader and founder and CEO of the mobile growth consulting firm Rocketship HQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner. Our guest today is David Barnard. David has been developing apps from the earliest days of the iTunes App Store. In the last 12 years, he has seen from close up every minor and major change that has played out in the app stores and with app store policies, from the first paid apps and their price drops, to the explosion of freemium, to the advent of subscriptions, and of course to the upcoming IDFA deprecation. In today's episode, he tells the stories of living through the roller coaster that the App Store has been from the viewpoint of somebody that has had real skin in the game and is no armchair expert. If you're wondering as to what relevance details from a decade ago will have on our world today, this episode will help you think about the unseen forces that have always influenced what we see on our phones and will continue to do so. This will help you understand how Apple's policies, even the subtlest choices, have influenced the kinds of apps that flourish on the app stores. Just as important, all of this helps contextualize the looming privacy changes that will effectively deprecate the IDFA in iOS 14. This episode provides a fascinating and in-depth look at how the last decade helps us learn about what's ahead, and we are excited to present it to you today. I'm very excited to welcome David Barnard to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
David, I'm thrilled to have you. Certainly, I've been wanting to have you on the show for a long time, partly because you're the real deal. You've seen...
Thank you.
Yeah, right. I mean, you've seen so much of how the App Store ecosystem has evolved since the earliest days. And you haven't just been an armchair expert, you have been a developer yourself. You have been an indie developer since 2008. And what's crazy is I go back and look at some of your writings from 2008 and 2009. So much of what you wrote, even back then, are so very prescient. Certainly, we'll touch on a lot of those, in a lot of what you wrote, and how monetization on the App Store has evolved over the years. We'll touch on all of that. But perhaps a good place to start would be for you to share your background, which I also find intriguing because you were not an experienced developer, you were not a designer, you're not even like a programming hobbyist when you launched your first app.
Nope.
Again, something we found in the course of our research was your photograph on the front page of the San Antonio Express News, which with a caption that said, "David Barnard reacts with joy, ... So that may or may not be related to what we're talking about. So tell us your story, what inspired you to start developing apps, and why that photograph is relevant to what we're talking about.
Sure. Okay, well, I'll see if I can condense it because it is a long story that starts like 14 years ago. But so I was a recording engineer and actually studied that at university. And as a recording engineer, I ended up switching to the Mac platform and got a PowerBook back in the day, which kind of got me into Apple's ecosystem. And so when the iPhone was announced, I was pretty excited. I was a pretty big Apple fanboy back then. And so I was just going to pick it up at some point, in the first few days. And then my brother calls me and is like, "Hey, let's go wait in line. Let's meet in San Antonio, and we'll wait in line and make sure that we can get an iPhone on day one." I was like, "Okay, that sounds like fun." And so we headed down to San Antonio. We stayed up all night. It was like this nerdy group of people camping out in the parking lot. And I was the first one in San Antonio to get an iPhone. I ended up being first in line because we just happened to get to the parking lot at just the right time. And so then that was 2007. I was working as a freelance recording engineer. I got married that fall and realized that it was not a good job to raise a family and be married. I was working like 2 PM till 2 AM, and my wife was working 9 to 5 and never saw her. And so I started, I've always been pretty entrepreneurial. And so I started seeing rumors that Apple was going to announce an SDK. And so I started coming up with ideas and writing a business plan and thinking about all that. And so I actually founded my company days after Steve Jobs announced the original iPhone SDK. And I actually intended to do the programming myself. But as you noted, I had zero experience. And so I got about 2 weeks into one of the programming books while simultaneously like talking with lawyers about incorporation papers and all that kind of stuff, and realized that, I was not going to be able to build a business and learn to code and ship a good app day one. So I started working with contract developers, and have ever since, a combination of contract developers and then I've also partnered with some developers on apps. And so from 2008, I've shipped 20 apps now, and I've sold 3 of them. So I've had 3 exits. I've had apps hit. I think I've had an app hit #1 top paid. I think Launch Center Pro hit #1 top paid. My Mirror app, it was a total fluke, but it had millions and millions of downloads. And so, over the course of the 12 years I've been doing this, I've seen, millions and millions of downloads and millions of dollars of revenue. I've been around the block.
Yeah. And you've done it yourself, right? You've done things hands-on, built your own apps.
Never hired an employee, never, it's all just been me. And then, a mishmash of contractors and friends and partners and, collaborators and whatnot. So.
Yeah, right. And you've seen from close up how much of a game changer the iTunes Store was. Not just that, you hitched your wagon to the iTunes Store. You started your own thing at the time. Before the mass market potential became very clear to everybody at the time.
Right.
So certainly, there's many aspects of the evolution that you've seen over the last decade or so that I want to dig into. But something that I think would be a good place to kick this off would be to get some idea and understanding of why the iTunes Store was such a big game changer. And it's my understanding that prior to the iTunes, one of the big changes that the iTunes Store made was make sure that buying software became so much cheaper. Prior to that, you had to go to a store, buy software for hundreds of dollars. Software could be games. You could buy games for hundreds of dollars, and this became so much cheaper. So would you agree that the price of software could be games, could be apps like yours, becoming so much cheaper was a big reason for this explosion? Or what else would you attribute the explosion of the App Store to at the time?
Yeah, this is something I've talked a lot about over the years, and could probably talk about for an hour, just this one topic, kind of unpacking the history of monetization, even in the first year or two of the App Store. I blogged about it, and John Gruber linked to my post, and I started meeting a lot of fellow developers through Twitter. So I had a front row seat to all this with made tons of friends who had, some of the top apps on the App Store in those early days. My apps did really well in those early days. So a lot of people who talk about 2008, 2009 and talk about that part of history, they didn't have skin in the game. They didn't have an app on the App Store. They're theorizing about these economic situation from visions of the past, not from having lived through it. So So, the App Store was a game changer in many ways. Apple, famously with their antitrust suits going on right now, has said that, they were the first, internet distribution. And you were talking about, physical distribution of software. By that time in 2008, there was already, the Palm Pilot had a store that you could download apps directly to your Palm Pilot. Software distribution online was already, very popular. But what changed with the App Store, and I think it was really the fundamental success of the App Store, was a combination of a few things. One is just the iPhone platform itself. I mean, multi-touch personal computing was just such a game changer. Like the entire interaction model of an iPhone was just so game changing to how humans interact with computers. And not just any computer, a computer in your pocket. And that was just such a fundamental game changer that honestly, I think that is really the primary driver. If people had been able to sell software on their own websites, I think we still would have seen a huge boom of software. But then I think, secondary to that, the App Store did bring a ton of value especially for small developers like me, where I didn't have to set up a payment provider. I didn't have to worry about collecting and distributing taxes. I didn't have to worry about, setting up a server to distribute the software. I didn't have to think about all these things. And again, people talking about it now, they're like, oh yeah, you would just use Stripe and, AWS is great. You could just, set up a Linode in 5 minutes. And it's like, back in 2008, it wasn't quite as seamless. There weren't all these super easy APIs and I don't know if GitHub even existed in 2008.
Yeah.
We were using SVN and other more primitive technologies. So yeah, in 2008, I think the App Store brought a tremendous amount of value in being a trusted place for consumers, that they knew they could go there. They knew Apple was approving the apps. Apple already had their credit card. They didn't have to go, buy each piece of software individually and type in their credit card each time. It downloaded right to the device. Apple did provide great curation. Most people thought the App Store editorial page early on thought it was just randomly, generated by an algorithm, because it didn't have the kind of human touch that we see now in the editorial pages with stories and, those kind of clear things. But there were humans behind that, picking the apps and helping to curate and stuff. So I do think that the App Store itself was a huge part of that. But again, I still say primarily it was just the platform itself. And I think, then stepping down another level, I think price did make a difference. I don't think, early on you had millions of people who had paid $699 unsubsidized, which was crazy at the time. I mean, there's a famous Steve Ballmer video of him laughing and saying, who's going to pay $699 for a phone unsubsidized? And clearly he was wrong. But the App Store, so the iPhone platform was already heavily skewed toward higher income individuals with a propensity to spend on technology, who probably were more, I wouldn't say nerdy, because my dad got an iPhone and he's not nerdy at all. But just, I think there was definitely a higher propensity to spend and kind of care about technology and care about the platform in those early days. So I think price was certainly partially a factor, that, you went from Palm Pilot, where a lot of the apps were $30 or more, to the iPhone. Even in the very early days, a lot of the apps were $10, $15, $20, and nobody kind of knew how to price. And but as I guess we'll talk about, that did quickly devolve. But yeah, so I'd say really the platform is what made it, and then the App Store was a secondary thing.
Certainly. And that seems like such a huge change for somebody today that's around a lot of free apps to know that, oh, apps cost $10 to $20, which can feel like a lot just now. But it's my understanding that at the very beginning, you just had paid apps. Is that accurate? Is that accurate to characterize?
Yeah, well, it's so fascinating to look back and think about how the entire App Store was framed from those early days that today we just think is bonkers, you know? So Steve Jobs said famously, you know, free apps are free. And so there were no in-app purchases allowed. He was like, we don't want our customers to be tricked downloading a free app and then having to then pay. So free apps are free. You can monetize via ads if you want, but free apps are free and paid apps are paid. And that was it. There were no in-app purchases for, 2-3 years. There were, if you wanted to make money, you either displayed ads. And again, like, you know, just drop AdMob in your app, drop Facebook Audience Network in your app, and you'll make plenty of money. I mean, this was 2008. Like, you know, I forget, AdMob was started right around that time, and I think launched pretty soon afterward, but it was also primitive. And like, you know, there was no guarantee you could just drop an ad network in and make it work. Flurry started around that time. It was all just like all kind of coming together. And so, you know, there were ad supported apps, and that started to take off and grow pretty quickly. But yeah, if you really wanted to make money directly from your customers, the only option was to have a paid app. And that certainly shaped the market tremendously from those early days. I mean, the first few years, with no in-app purchase, no ability to do freemium, it really, you know, those early days of the App Store, you charged for your app, and that was the way you made money.
How did that shape the App Store and the kinds of apps that were out there at the time?
Well, I think, you know, there's a lot of things that I think contributed to kind of the early shape of the market. One of the biggest things in my mind was the way the shape of the App Store itself. And this is something, I mean, again, I could talk 30 minutes just on like the economic principles behind the shape of a market influencing the products that are then delivered in that marketplace. And so Apple, with every little decision they made on how the App Store worked, what apps they approved and didn't approve, how they ran the top lists, how they promoted apps within the store. Like every little decision they made shaped the market in a specific way that then influenced the pricing, that influenced the apps that were made, influenced, you know, what apps did well and what apps didn't do well. And so Apple heavily shaped that market. And, you know, I wrote a post in like 2009 saying the App Store is not a free market, because you had all these people saying, oh, the App Store is just a marketplace like any other. There's going to be competition. Prices are going to trend downward as competition increases and all that sort of thing. But I think that really misses just how much influence Apple had over the App Store, especially in those early days. I think they've lost some of that control over the years. You know, with Facebook and Google ads being a higher proportion of downloads a lot of times than some of their efforts for curation and whatnot. But honestly, I think one of the biggest influences early on was that Apple had two top charts. They had top free apps and they had top paid apps. And the top paid apps were sorted by download volume solely. So it didn't matter if your price was $30 and you got 1,000 downloads, or your price was $1 and you got 1,000 downloads. Whoever had the most downloads showed up the highest in the charts. And so that to me is just is the perfect example of how the market wasn't free, and that Apple heavily shaped the market through those seemingly seemingly inconsequential decisions to do something like that. It seems like normal, like, oh, top charts, that's the most downloaded, and you know, top free is top downloaded free, and the top paid is the top downloaded paid. But what quickly happened was that developers realized, well, if I have my app priced at $5 and I'm only getting 1,000 downloads at $5, I'm making 5,000 downloads, $5,000 a day. If I drop my price to 99 cents, I can get 5,000 downloads a day, make the same $5,000, but I'm going to show up higher in the charts. And then guess what happens when an app is high in the charts? Oh, it must be a good app. People are downloading it, so that the charts carried a bit of social proof with them. And so the higher you get up in the charts, it actually was its own form of marketing that you would get paid, that you would get additional organic installs just from showing up high in the charts. So what we saw really quickly, and again, like you have all these onlookers who are like, oh no, that was just normal market pressure, prices just drop in a competitive market. But those people didn't have apps in the store making those decisions personally. So like I played the game, right? I put my app on sale and I saw the download skyrocket, and then I had friends who played the game and their app skyrocketed. It was a 99-cent app and it skyrocketed to number one. And once it hit number one, it stayed at number one for weeks and weeks and weeks. So even at 99 cents, they were making tens of thousands of dollars. I guess at that time it was maybe tens of thousands of dollars a week, because the marketplace was still relatively small. So you weren't making like hundreds of thousands of dollars a day at 99 cents, even at the top of the chart. But anyways, so for those of us who had that front row seat, we could just see plain as day that the incentive for dropping the price was the charts. It was exposure. And then a lot of sites came along that if you dropped your price, there were newsletters like the price drops, like get the apps while they're on sale. And so in the early days, like we were playing that game all the time. Like we were dropping prices, to put the app on sale. And I mean, there were times I'd make $10,000, $15,000 in a day just by dropping the price a couple of bucks and then raising the price back up. And so but all of that kind of thing, I think, is a more natural kind of market pressure of like, stores do this all the time. Black Friday is a great example. So those are more natural market forces. But when you drop your price specifically to show up high in the charts, which then garners more attention, like that's how the game kind of started and devolved from there. So nobody would care to read it, but there could be whole books and economic white papers written on some of the market dynamics that were happening in those early days.
Certainly, right. And the way you describe it, I think every single micro decision that Apple made around how it structured the App Store basically dictated all these behaviors that, as you said, was like incentivized the developers to drop their prices, right? They were like, look, this is the incentive scheme that Apple is going to set up. The lower your price goes, the more money you make, which can still be a fortune for an independent developer, for a small developer, even like thousands of dollars, right? So, which is fascinating. And like you said, every micro decision, and I can't imagine it wasn't intentional, because they could see the consequences of their design choices.
I forgot to finish answering your question, because again, I could talk about that one question for an hour easily. But I think the thrust of your question though was like, how did it impact what kind of apps were made? And I think that is actually a really important thing to address. I know, especially for indies, but even for some of the bigger companies, when you saw those kind of market dynamics, it was really hard to build a sophisticated app and come to the market at $30, $40. And since you couldn't do any kind of subscription or multiple in-app purchases or any other way to monetize those users other than ads or paid app, you did kind of see the market shift toward the kind of apps that could go more mass market versus kind of more sophisticated tools. And I think that's what we're seeing a huge shift today with the subscription model, is that because you're able to charge higher prices and have that income be recurring, we're seeing much more sophisticated apps being built today, even in smaller niches of the App Store, because it can support that. And early on, even with my $5 apps, like I did experimentation with marketing, and we didn't have Facebook level targeting where you could find business owners and direct them towards my mileage log app. So maybe it could have been more successful back then with that kind of targeting. But early on, I mean, I would do experiments with paid marketing. I did one where I paid a $30 CPM to Macworld magazine. And I forget exactly how much I spent, but I think it was a grand or two. And it drove like $100 in revenue, because being paid up front with no free trials, no way for people to get a sense of the quality of the app before ponying up the money, doing paid advertising on a paid app, the numbers just didn't work. And again, it's like, you go back, this was the dark ages. Like, we didn't have zero way to track a installs from an ad. It was just all back of the envelope incrementality testing. You would you would do a marketing campaign and you would like watch for lift, and then any organic lift, or if you happen to get a press mention or you happen to update the app. In the early days, it was hard to make any kind of concrete determination about how your ad spend was affecting revenue. But even then, it was just any marketing I did was so clearly ineffective. At some point in 2009, AdMob gave developers something like $4,000 or $5,000 of free ads if you just signed up for their platform, because they just had so much inventory and just were burning the VC cash to get market share, which is smart. They got bought by Google for billions. But or maybe hundreds of millions, because Google bought them pretty early. But anyways, I mean, I did $5,000 of marketing with AdMob, and the return on that $5,000 was minuscule. I mean, I saw just hundreds of dollars lift on thousands of dollars of ad spend. So not being able to charge more, not being able to more effectively do paid marketing, it did really shape what was built. It shaped the kind of developers who came to the market. There were apps like Evernote's a great example where, that was a VC-backed business. You could subscribe on the web, and the app itself was free on the App Store. And Apple did allow those sorts of apps that had a subscription online or some, online payment to kind of have. And that's still to this day somewhat the like business exclusion or the reader app exclusion. It's like, if Evernote had a certain amount of functionality standalone for free on the App Store, then Evernote could charge their subscription online. But those were few and far between. In those early days, there weren't a lot of those kind of businesses built. And, I think that those that were built were incredibly visionary compared to us indies who just kept scrapping it out, trying to build trying to get a hit app and trying to get that mass market success. But there were so many factors in play in those early days with the way Apple did things, with just the incredibly limited tooling we had for things like measuring ad spend, and the limited analytics that we had. Like Flurry ramped up pretty quickly, and there were a couple of other companies early on that tried to do things, and from looking in hindsight from 2020, they were so crude and compared to the kind of tools that we have today. So it was fun. It was fun times though, man. It was such a nascent industry, and you just didn't know what was going to work and what wasn't. And there's a lot of experimentation, and it was certainly a fun time to be building apps.
Certainly. It also sounds to me like at the time, the way the App Store was designed and constructed, it wasn't amenable to building sophisticated apps, relatively complex apps, or relatively niche apps, as you expressed. So at what point did it become clear that, this could support big businesses, hundreds of millions of dollar businesses? Did you feel like there was a point when that became clear, either in Apple's decisioning choices or the entry of larger developers? I'm wondering if there was any point when you saw maybe there was a switch that was flipped.
that's a really interesting question, because I think in some ways early on, I think there was a over optimistic view that then proved to not pan out as big as was expected at the time. So, for example, Kleiner Perkins did $100 million fund to fund apps. And I believe they announced it either at the, I believe they announced it with the SDK, so in March of 2008. And if I'd have thought of this before our show, I would have gone and researched to see what investments they made and how those panned out. But my guess is that fund did not perform especially well, unless maybe they did stumble upon one big hit. And, maybe they invested in Evernote, which has, has struggled as of late, but, did grow to, I think, near unicorn or maybe unicorn status at some point. But yeah, so early on, there was a lot of optimism around the potential of the platform. And then in part because of those dynamics, it does seem like there were a few years where, like, there weren't as many kind of big ambitious projects launched, or some of the big ambitious projects that were launched, flamed out pretty quickly. I think games were kind of like the early big winners. Like, that was really obvious that games were making great money, both as paid, or especially as paid, but then, some of the freemium ad-supported games started to do well. And then I think, and this is kind of like the history of monetization, a brief overview of the history of monetization on the platform. Apple did enable in-app purchase in, I believe it was 2010. And that's when you really started to see the rise of freemium games. So there was about a two, and I should have gotten my dates all lined up so I could know this offhand, but it's somewhere in that 2 to 3 year range. It was either 2010 or 2011 when they announced the in-app purchases. And so, there was like this 2 year period that was somewhat stunted, but it also kind of aligns with like the growth of the iPhone itself, right? Because like early on, like when they launched the App Store, there were, single digit millions of people who had an iPhone. And then by 2009, they were hitting, double digit millions of people who owned an iPhone. And then by 2010, when they announced in-app purchases, there were tens of millions of people who owned an iPhone. And so underlying some of these market dynamics that were in play in those early years was also just the incredible growth of the platform itself. But yeah, so then in 2010-ish, they announced in-app purchases, and so then you could at least start experimenting with freemium, with true freemium models. Back in the early days, we did do light apps that were free, and then tried to push people to paid. So there was like some level of freemium experimentation going on, but it was a very poor substitute for real freemium. We've seen the platform grow tremendously over the last 12 years. So I don't think that, but I think the two big milestones for monetization were the addition of in-app purchases and then Apple opening up subscriptions. So early on in like 2013, they started in 2010 when they launched the iPad, they allowed, newspapers and Netflix and people like that to use subscriptions. Then in 2013, they started opening it more to like health and fitness apps and like other things that kind of made sense for subscriptions. And then in 2016, they kind of like opened the doors a little more widely for subscription monetization. And I think that combination of freemium and the subscription business model is what's helped propel the App Store to where it is today, where we are starting to see, so many very sophisticated, very, big companies built around mobile. And that's kind of our thesis at RevenueCat, where we hadn't really talked about that. I did join RevenueCat, and it's partly because of my bullishness around, where things are headed. But what we're seeing is mobile first companies using the subscription business model to grow into unicorns. You have Calm and Headspace, and then Lightricks famously was kind of one of the early ones that first raised at a $1 billion valuation, and they're selling a subscription to a selfie editing app, which still kind of blows my mind. But people are willing to pay for that. And so, now, and it's really fun as a developer advocate at RevenueCat, I am constantly talking to developers and get to see these really fun niche apps that people are building because the subscription app model allows them to monetize it.
Sure.
So we have somebody, indie developer building an app for knitters. So it's called, I think it's called Yarn Buddy, which is super cool. Like, who would ever bother building for such a small niche? And it'll probably never be like a huge business, but like those are the kind of niches that could support an indie developer full time. And I spoke to a developer of an orienteering app yesterday, which was fascinating. It's a small niche. It's not going to support a VC-backed company, but he can carve out a really nice business there. So yeah, I think freemium starting in 2010 really started to change things, and then I think it really accelerated with subscription app model. And again, people forget too all the little rules and nitpicky things that Apple's done over the years. So they've been really picky about any kind of free trial-ish thing. And then finally, you can do free trials if you use Apple's subscription free trial. And they've been picky about doing any free trial that doesn't use their subscriptions. And so all those kind of things continue to shape, what's built and how we build them, and not to mention all the little nitpicky app review things about, using frameworks and their intended purpose instead of like building more innovative stuff that kind of pushes the boundaries. And so there's just there's so much that has transpired over the last 12 years as we've come to this point.
Yeah. And what I'm also taking away is that the two big inflections were the advent of freemium, and then the ascendance of subscriptions.
Right.
Again, I'm fascinated by how these policies influenced the kinds of apps that really took off. Right, you touched on how the subscription sort of model taking off has influenced the sustainability of more niche products. And certainly, I think you talked about how the freemium economy really led to the ascendance of the entirety of the app ecosystem. I'm curious, with iOS 14 coming in, are there certain sort of aspects of this dynamic that Apple is trying to reverse that could be because of what's happened over the last decade or so? How are you looking at iOS 14 and just some of the impact of freemium and subscription models that feel may or may not have been intended consequences of these policy changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's like smaller microeconomic and larger macroeconomic impacts of these things. So, for example, I think the switch to freemium, in addition to kind of opening up the in-app purchase business model and freemium games and things like that, kind of opened up the App Store to some of the darker motivations of those. So, a free weather app for example, monetizing via ads, could also sell their user location data. And the incentive there was to get as many people using the app as you possibly could, because the location data was so much more valuable than trying to charge people what they were used to paying for apps. So Weather Channel is a fantastic example. IBM bought them, and I don't know, if this is really true or not, but I can't help but believe that one of the primary motivations behind IBM buying the Weather Channel was the treasure trove of location data. IBM does a lot of consulting. I mean, I imagine they even have like defense contracts and things like that. And so here you have the most popular weather app in the US with just a treasure trove of real-time location information and even background location information, because with a weather app, you might want to know if a tornado alert comes in. And so you turn on always on location. And, multiple times a day, sometimes multiple times an hour, your precise location is being uploaded to their server, and you're essentially able to be tracked 24/7. And I can imagine that was one of the primary motivations for IBM buying that business, was to have that data to power so much of their other consulting and other businesses. And so I think those sorts of things and, privacy related stuff that's gotten really dicey with freemium apps over the years is what's motivating Apple to make some of these big changes. For example, with the IDFA, there's two primary ways that the Weather Channel can track you individually as you move around the city, country, whatever, is that they would need to upload your IDFA every time that they also collect that location information. And they do, and they did, and they have. And, I have a weather app, and companies came to me and were offering, to pay me monthly based on the number of users I had if I would insert their SDK to continually hit their S3 bucket with data from my users. And so those kind of things are what has pushed Apple to limit the ability to do that level of tracking. The Weather Channel can also do it on IP address, but that's much more fuzzy, much harder to kind of fingerprint and really track one individual user. Although they can track your home IP addresses don't change these days. And so like when I'm at home using the internet, I realize even with Apple's tracking prevention that I'm the only iPhone 11 Pro that shows up at my IP address. And so any app, any website that's able to determine my screen size and IP address has a pretty good idea who I am. There's been a lot of theories around Apple wanting to kind of regain control of app install, where Google and Facebook do have a lot of sway in the iPhone market because they drive such a high volume of the installs and are able to capture so much revenue with their app install business. And so Apple limiting access to the IDFA and iOS 14, which they have postponed, but is still coming, I think is partially a reaction to that, to kind of, personally, I think the primary motivation is to regain control of the privacy side of things, to where to limit apps' ability to collect and collate these vast amounts of data on users and build these, shadow profiles that are being built on people in the background that, they have no idea. And like, personally, I'm a lot less worried privacy-wise about Google and Facebook and some of these bigger companies where like, I can go to Facebook and delete the data they have. I can turn off certain tracking. They at least give you those kind of tools, and you at least know when you're using the Facebook app that there's some level of tracking that they're doing. Like that's kind of generally understood among consumers that Facebook has a lot of data on you. Well, there's a ton of companies operating in the shadows that have developers installing these SDKs that are building these shadow profiles on people, and you have no idea who they are. You have no idea what data they have. And if they're installed in multiple apps on your phone, there's so much that they can, triangulate about you and your behaviors and your location and everything else. And so I think Apple is bringing the hammer down on that. And to me, I think that's the primary motivation is to start limiting that kind of extensive tracking of its users. And I think it's genuinely a good thing for humanity that random companies you've never heard of are not going to be able to continue tracking us the way they have been. But it has other consequences, and we're going to see play out over the next 9 to 18 months. In 3 or 4 months, they're going to fully enact the rules that were announced around iOS 14, and then we'll see it play out over the next 9 to 18 months how it really impacts the App Store economy. But it is going to be a huge shift. And I think there's a lot of unknowns. And you have a lot of companies out there, MMPs and others kind of very boldly claiming they know how it's going to play out and boldly claiming that their, tracking solutions are going to be okay. And I don't think that's the case. And I think Apple's going to be watching all of this very closely and potentially banning certain SDKs that aren't following their rules, whether the spirit of the rules or the letter of the rules. This is a next phase shift for the entire mobile app economy. That it's going to incentivize new things. It's going to change the way people do business. It's going to limit the effectiveness of targeted advertising. It's going to limit our ability to measure the effectiveness. But new tools are already being built, and new ways of advertising are going to be, and new ways of targeting, and new ways of measuring, and new ways of understanding are going to be built. And personally, I think, especially for developers like me, I think this is somewhat going to be a return to the fundamentals. It's like it'll somewhat shift back toward who can build the best product and retain their users. Like I've seen a lot of apps come up over the last few years, speaking of motivations, if you can charge $10 a week and trick enough people into subscribing, and Facebook can get really good at targeting those users who are going to forget to turn off their or cancel their subscription. There's a lot of businesses that have been built on those kind of economics with those kind of motivations. And I think that, this is going to be somewhat a reset of some of those incentives by making it harder to more directly target those users, making it harder to more directly measure the results and feed Facebook's algorithms. So the apps that are going to succeed in this new paradigm, I think, need to get back to the basics, like product, retention, and I think, for all the talk about efficiency going down and stuff like that, I think, some of the efficiency and measurement, it has just been an illusion. So if you're building a great product and, you're going to find ways to effectively and cost effectively market that. I think some of the apps who don't have a great product are hopefully going to struggle in this new paradigm more than the apps that do. So
certainly, and what I do find fascinating about everything you said is that I think the roots of what is unfolding now lie in how the free-to-play economy came into being, because I think free-to-play and freemium wasn't a problem in and of itself, but it engendered a set of incentives that basically was like, as you pointed out, the Weather Channel could sell its location data to monetize, right? If it was purely ad supported, it would have been much, much harder, or there wouldn't have been nearly as many incentives. Or if it was purely paid, there wouldn't have been nearly as many incentives. But having the free-to-play model eventually led to hyper targeting of users, led to the IDFA being as powerful and as critical as it is today, right? And certainly that led to problems that I don't think Apple envisioned at the time. And I think that led to problems that the developers didn't see as problems, right? Because I think we've all been weaned on. When I talk to web people who have done advertising on the app, they're still amazed, surprised, and shocked at the amount of data amount of personal data that mobile app marketers tend to have. So I think we all took that for granted to a certain extent. And what I'm taking away from everything you said, David, is there were unintended consequences of these monetization choices that Apple made. And I think certainly shifting to subscriptions helped curb some of these to a certain extent. But I think Apple's taking back a lot of that control with iOS 14. While I think iOS 14 still allows freemium and free to play, right? And I think the free to play isn't a problem in and of itself. What Apple is curbing is the unintended consequences of the free to play really exploding.
Right. Yeah, and it's a good point too. Is that, and again, this is why I'm really bullish on subscriptions. Two of my apps are subscription, and it was in installing subscriptions into my app that was just a mess. Is why I ended up at RevenueCat, and then now not only do I get to like run my subscription app business personally, but then I get to like as developer advocate to work with all these developers. We're working on a podcast and a community of subscription app developers and things like that, and so I'm just so inundated in this. So you can take all this with a huge grain of salt. But why I'm so bullish about subscriptions is that it does realign incentives. So if you set aside the apps that get really good at tricking people into subscribing and finding the users who forget to unsubscribe, that is definitely a part of the market, and it's a part that I personally hope suffers in the coming years. But if you put that aside, most subscription apps are very directly aligned with creating value for users. And a great example of this is like I use VSCO, the photo editing app. And when they first moved to subscription, I was like, $20 a year. All right, I'll do it. And I'm a happy subscriber. I only use the app a few times a month. I don't use it every day. They're not incentivized to like send me a push notification every 24 hours and get me back in the app. It's like their incentive is to just build a great tool and make sure that user experience for me is so awesome. When I do want to edit a photo, I've got the presets I love. They've got a ton of great features for editing that I've gotten used to using. And so if they can just continue delivering that value to me, I might be a VSCO subscriber for 10 years. And at $20 a year, a $200 lifetime value for me, like that's incredible. And guess what? I'm actually pretty happy to pay it because I love the app and it brings value to me. And so, the people talking about like subscription to fatigue and worried that if every app moves to subscriptions, consumers are going to revolt and everything. I think what's missing there is kind of the analysis of like what people are actually going to pay for. And so you will have people who grudgingly subscribe to an app that they don't really love or care about just because they need a tool or whatever. But I think predominantly what you're seeing is that consumers are subscribing to things they care about and they're willing to pay because these apps are bringing value in a way that hasn't been available and hasn't been practical for developers to build given previous monetization models. So for example, again, RevenueCat customer and somebody I've gotten to talk to quite a bit over the last year since joining is Fitness AI. It's a perfect example. He went through Y Combinator and raised money but for a fitness app, you spend $60 a year. You spend $60 a session for a personal trainer. You spend $60 a month on a gym membership. And his app has really sophisticated, machine learning around how to progress through sets, how to build programs. And he had collected a ton of that data from an app previously and then built Fitness AI on top of it. And the subscription business model aligns him with these users who are thrilled to pay $60 a year to enhance what they're already spending $60 a month at the gym. And so I think what we're going to see play out in the coming years is that there's going to be all sorts of tools that get built, and not just tools, but entertainment experiences and other things that deliver deep value to people. And when you actually are delivering that level of value, the subscription model and even the pricing starts to become much more tenable to consumers. Another great example is Flighty. It's a friend of mine who built that app. It's a flight tracking app, and it is phenomenal. And he couldn't have built that without a subscription model. His data costs are insane because flight data is really expensive. But because of the subscription model, he was able to build an incredible tool for people who are flying all the time. And guess what? You're paying $300, $600 a flight. and he charges, I think it's 60, 80 bucks a year. So you're, 60, 80 bucks a year to have this sophisticated tool in your pocket that tells you, where your plane is at any time, if it's going to be running late, what your gate is going to be. You land and it sends you a notification of like where to pick up your bags and like what the weather is and how to get to the Uber. And like, these kind of tools I think are just going to continue to enhance our lives and add value. And being able to charge users for that value is the key to being able to build that stuff. And so I kind of feel like, honestly, over the last probably 2 or 3 years, we're kind of, it really is maybe the biggest fundamental change to incentives alignment that we've ever seen in mobile app businesses. And I think we're just in the early phases of that. I think we're going to see just entirely new classes of apps that come out. I'm actually really bullish too for not just B2C apps, but B2B apps. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see mobile first B2B solutions, everybody's doing more and more work remote and on the go. And so, you kind of see that already with certain apps that are more business focused. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. So, I think we're in the early innings of a very long game that's pretty excited to be involved in.
Definitely. I like how you phrase it as an incentive realignment. Certainly, I think subscriptions have allowed a whole new class of apps to flourish. And I also like the example you gave earlier on about the knitting app, which couldn't have flourished as a free-to-play app at all. That would be very challenging for a knitting app to have consumables or being a one-time paid app. Neither of those models would have worked. But I personally like to look at these as a micro utilities, which is these are utilities for a specific niche of the population, like the flight tracker app, the knitting app. And I know you mentioned the last time we spoke about a fishing app for a certain category of people. For a certain category of people, that's something they would use daily or weekly. And that's all the app needs to flourish. And it sounds like the system of incentives is enabling that to happen rather than just free-to-play mass market apps, which again are healthy and have their place. But I think this is a complete realignment of how the app economy is going to evolve.
Yeah. And I think important to that as well is a realignment of consumer spending. So, people are like, oh, wow, I'm going to have to subscribe to that. I got to pay for software. Like subscriptions suck. And like, you hear all this, like, negative from certain people, especially, I'm more in the like indie developer scene on Twitter and stuff. And there's just a lot of BS floating around, but I think what we're seeing is one, the younger generation who is raised on software. They're used to software providing value in their life, even more so than me as a Gen Xer. I'm 41 years old. Like, I had a Nintendo Entertainment System and a Commodore 64, and like software didn't really start delivering much value in my life until like late high school and college, and even after that. And so my perspective and propensity to spend is higher compared to previous generations, but lower compared to the generations coming who are used to digital experiences enhancing their life and adding value. And so, if you think about consumer spending more broadly, you have, somebody who goes out to eat a lot, they're spending 60, 80, 100, 200 bucks, or a foodie going to fine restaurants, maybe spending $200 or $300 a meal on these experiences because it brings value, they enjoy them and everything else like that. Well, if there's a foodie app that contributed to that experience and, alerted you to the next hot restaurant and a community of foodies that you could talk to and stuff like that, $60 a year. And that's where I don't even think we're kind of seeing the threshold of what you're going to be able to charge for some of these apps. I think the like what we're seeing, you know, 60, 80, $100 a year is just a start. I think that you're going to have niches that are and value created through these mobile experiences that are going to bring so much value that paying $200 a year for a foodie app when you're spending $200 a meal on your in-person experiences, if you can find ways to add that kind of value to those kind of experiences, then, you know, pricing is going to look a lot different. And then you have apps like, you know, Tinder is just crushing it. And what's really fascinating to me about Tinder is that not only are they using the subscription model, but they have consumable purchases in there.
Yes.
And I think we're also at the beginning stages of subscription apps figuring out how to better monetize the true fans who would excitedly spend hundreds of dollars a year in the app, not just a $20 a year subscription. And I think we're going to see that more and more. And you've already seen that shift in the last probably 5 to 10 years. You know, Taylor Swift, when she releases an album, she releases all these, you know, special editions that are hundreds of dollars. And Radiohead famously did things like that as well. And most artists do that sort of thing, and merchandise, and, you know, finding other ways to monetize, to where a hardcore Taylor Swift fan who just loves that experience and loves her music and loves the persona, they may be spending thousands of dollars a year on a combination of merchandise and premium albums. And, you know, some of these artists are creating their own apps now that are subscription apps for like their own communities and stuff. So I think we're at the very, very early stages of really exploring how much value mobile devices can bring to our lives. And then, and you know, it's kind of funny to say that in 2020. It's like, oh, well, that's obvious. Like, it's obvious that like the iPhone brings a ton of value. Like, everybody has a mobile device now, and like, of course, they bring a lot of value. And then, of course, I mean, I think there's a lot of negatives with screen addiction and things like that. But I really think, again, I think we're still in the early days of figuring out what that's really going to look like in the coming decades, in part because we haven't had the monetization and the incentives alignment that we are starting to see now with subscriptions and the freemium business model and other things starting to come together. And so yeah, I think we're in the early stages of the next phase of mobile.
Certainly, David. This has been a wide-ranging conversation, and it certainly is one that fills me with optimism and hope for what's coming for the app economy. Right. Certainly, there's some amount of uncertainties in the short term, but definitely, you know, there's definitely fills me with a lot of hope for what's coming medium to long term for us. This perhaps is a good place for us to start to wrap, David. But before we do that, can you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Sure. Embarrassingly, you can follow me on Twitter. I rant. I try to not get too much into politics and things like that, but I'll rant on Apple and complain about what their latest gimmicks are and whatever. As I said, I didn't really get into it much, but I am developer advocate at RevenueCat. And so keep an eye on the RevenueCat blog for more of this kind of, you know, thoughts on the future of subscriptions and the future of the app economy. And then I'm also, as part of my job at RevenueCat, I'm launching a podcast called Subclub.
Yeah, we'll link to all of that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, so I guess that's about it.
Excellent. Yeah, David, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom. And I know this has been 12 years of your experience, and I really do appreciate how you distilled all of your wisdom. Especially, I think I value this so much because I think knowing and understanding where we came from helps us be better informed about where we are going. And certainly a lot of the impact of past decisions being very interesting and fascinating for me to know and understand through our conversation today. So thank you so much for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
It was really fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here.
or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.